Welcome, this is Jennifer, and I am glad you are here as always. And today I really think you'll like this technique because we're going to create the look of textured stamping and stenciling. And all you need are some basic supplies. It almost looks like these images are fabric, and it really creates a great result and gives a unique look to supplies that you have. Now, I will first demonstrate this technique with stamping, which by the way is a 2-for-1 technique, and then I will demonstrate also with stencils. So a lot to share, so let's dive in. We'll start with faux textured stamping or faux fabric stamping, and this is a 2-for-1 technique. Now the products that I use today, some of them are from this new Gina K Designs kit. This is the Pocketful of Sunshine. This kit is a huge value. You get all the things you see here for, I think it's under $60. I really like her kits because it has a wide variety of things included, so you can make a wide variety style of cards, and the value is outstanding. So in here we have 2 large 6x8 stamp sets. I'll be using the one on the left. Then there is a layering stencil set, which I'll be using, coordinating die sets for both of the stamp sets, and then a bonus die set, that little pocket set. I'm not using that today, but I love that she added that as a free gift. Also at the end here, I'll show you another way to get a free gift. I'm going to try to include those in videos because we are always excited to find good deals and save some money. So anyways, several of the products I used are from this kit. However, if you watch this later on, these products will probably be sold separately. And I have some other products I'll be using. Some of them are older ones. But keep in mind, I will suggest other types of products you could use so you can shop your stash. These first few cards involve lots of stamping, so I have my MISTI stamping tools set up with my waffle flower grip mat inside to help hold the paper in place. I also have the new Gina K Designs Ornate Fans background stamp. I love the look of this one. You'll definitely be seeing this in many videos in the future, and I use it many times today. Any kind of background stamp with detail would be ideal here. Now I have the Gina K Designs layering weight white cardstock here because it's super smooth, which is helpful for this technique, but you can use whatever white cardstock you have. Next, I'm inking up the stamp with Gina K Designs white pigment ink, and I'll stamp this as well as I can. Like, I'm going to really put some pressure on this. You can even double stamp it if you feel that your ink pad is a little bit dry. But I find any white pigment ink will work for this. Gina K has a bright white. Now, the stamp that I'm using is from the kit that I showed you before. This is the All Occasions flower set, and it has this beautiful flower here. Now, keep in mind, the little paintbrush stroke images would be great for this technique. For this part of the technique, you want stamps with solid area to it. Now, this flower has got a lot of good solid area to it, so it'll work great. So I'm putting my stamped piece back into the MISTI. So that's white cardstock with that white stamped background image. You can't see it, but it's there. On top of that, I'm placing our solid image. And we're going to stamp on top of this with dye ink. Make sure every time you ink up your stamp that it's clean. So I picked up some of that white pigment ink when I placed the stamp down, so I wiped that off. And now I'm stamping on top with a dye ink. I'm using Gina K Designs dye inks today, and I'll put the colors on the screen. Now I stamped that on top of our white pigment ink, and now I'm bringing in a piece of plain white cardstock, and I'll stamp the extra ink that's on the stamp onto that plain white cardstock. So this is like a second generation. But because we have that white pigment ink under that purple ink, you'll see it show through our dark image, and you'll see it creates a really cool effect in our second generation image, which I'll give you a closer look at in a moment. Now I really want to intensify this, so I'm going to repeat the process. I've completely cleaned our stamp, and I'm inking it up again with that dark lilac and stamping it on the first panel that has that white pigment ink stamped image on the background. Again, it's hard to see, but it's there. Then I'll take our plain white cardstock and stamp what's left on our stamp onto it, right on top of what we did before. And this is going to create a really cool second generation image. That's where you use the extra ink for another image that's softer. So now let's take a closer look. Here on the left, we have the piece that has the white background stamp. You can kind of see it there. And notice how it creates that kind of faux fabric look on our dark stamping that we did on top. That's because the white pigment ink kind of resists that darker ink, just a little bit. It's a nice subtle look. Now the second panel where we just started with plain white cardstock and we stamped all of our extra or second generation ink on, look it has a fun faux texture to it also. That's because remember how I said the white pigment ink on the first piece kind of resists some of that ink we stand on top, the purple ink we stamp on top, leaving it on the stamp. So it actually in the second generation piece, the background stamped image looks a little bit darker with lighter color around it. It makes for a beautiful faux fabric image and we get 2 for 1. Now let's repeat this to put flowers kind of up above that to kind of fill a card background. So I have a clean stamp and I'm placing it over that white stamped background. And then I will clean off the stamp. I want to make sure I don't get any white ink on my purple ink pad. I'll ink up my stamp with that dark purple ink and stamp it firmly onto the background. Again, we're stamping on top of that white pigment ink. Now that white pigment ink, I did not dry it first. I felt that it gave best results if I just stamped the white background and then went directly to this step of the technique. Now I take my plain white cardstock and stamp all the extra second generation ink on top. Now you can see it's softer there, so I'm going to repeat the process one more time. Now as far as what color of inks you can use here, I do feel that I get best results usually with a darker ink so that you can see the technique more, but it really just depends on the color and the dye ink that you're using, so I encourage you to test out what you have. Now I'll put the other one on top and stamp all that extra ink on it to give us that faux textured second generation look. And I love that one is bold, one is soft, but both have that look of fabric to it. If you really wanted a more intense look to this technique, start with a detailed image that has even more detail than the one that I chose, maybe one that's like a fine texture weave or maybe a fine stripe. That would be more impressive, I guess you would say, but I really like the ornate fans for this and that you really can't see a formal pattern inside of the stamping, but instead just see that look of texture. So try any kind of background stamp that has detail for your white pigment stamping, and then on top of it stamp an image that has a lot of solid area with your dye ink. All right, now that we have our card panel stamped, let's stamp our note card. I have a top folding 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch purple note card, and I'm lining it up with that same ornate fan stamp. I just love the design of this. I will stamp this with white pigment ink. I'm telling you, white pigment ink is one of the best, most useful inks you can have in your stash. And I'll actually link to a video where I talk about many things you can do with it up here on the top right and at the end of this video. It's a must-have ink. So after I've stamped that, you can see I missed a little spot there in the middle. It doesn't matter because it's going to get covered up. After I stamp that, you can see you get a beautiful, subtle stamped image. But I wanted to add some shine to it. So around the outside edges, I'm using Ranger Perfect Pearl, and I'm applying this pigment powder only to the outside edge since the center will get covered up. I use a brush to apply a light layer, a little goes a long way, and then I use a dry cloth to wipe off the excess. If you want, you can spray with a fixative or a light mist of water, but I just leave it as is. Now I have a little bit of shine to that pattern, and that pattern matches the pattern we have in our stamping. Now to cut my card panel, I used one of my favorites, the Gina K Designs Master Layouts 2 die set. Highly recommend this one because it cuts a faux stitched rectangle and then a solid rectangle that's very slightly bigger. So no need to measure things out to get that nice fine detailed mat. Absolutely love it. And I'll also be using a sentiment from this Modern Roses stamp set. I've used this in a video before and I'll link to that up here in the top right so you can get some more ideas. I really like the sentiments in this one and that there are coordinating dies to cut them out. So off screen I created 4 of these. I like the technique so much that I did it twice. You can see that bit of pearly shine on our stamping on the note card, and then that bit of faux textured stamping that we have with the technique we did there for the dark purple. Now you can see I used a darker purple cardstock for that fine cut mat that the Master Layouts 2 die set does. I added the Love and Hugs right there in the center, stamped on black ink, stamped with black ink on white cardstock, and I also added a few gemstones for sparkle. I really like having that bit of shine around the outside edge. It just adds another layer to the card. So here are the 2 cards that I created with that first generation stamping. This is the one where we stamped the white background image with white, and then we stamped on top of it with the darker dye ink. Nice bold images, and you could do these in a variety of colors. Now here are the second generation ones. These are much softer. I did the rest of the card in the same way, but notice the softer look that you get with this. You get that faux fabric look for the florals, where the stamping is darker, where that ornate fan was stamped is darker than the rest of the flower around it. Now I chose a solid image with a lot of detail to it. If you really want your pattern to show up more, you would want to use a more simple solid pattern, like maybe a solid butterfly or a solid circle or a solid heart. But I think it works really well with this floral. So with this technique, with stamping, we end up with a 2-for-1 deal where you do one technique and get 2 cards. Let's do another pair of cards with this faux textured stamping technique, but I have a fun twist to one of them that I'll share at the end. For this, I'm using the Gina K Design's Beautiful Birds 2 stamp. Now again, these are mostly solid images, but not completely solid. If you really want striking impression with this technique, you would want a totally solid image, but I kind of like the more subtle look. So this bird is a good choice. I'm once again using that Ornate Fans background stamp and stamping with white pigment ink on white cardstock. Just make sure whatever stamp you use here has fine detail to it. I wouldn't go with less detail than this one has. All right, once I've stamped that, I will line up the bird on top of that. I didn't take the time to heat set the ink. I feel like it's good to do this technique right away while it's still wet. So I'll stamp this with a darker ink. I'm using Blue Raspberry, which is like a medium to dark bright blue color from Gina K that I love. I will stamp that on top of our white background stamping. Then I will take a plain piece of white cardstock, put it on top. You can see that extra ink still on my stamp, and I'll stamp that onto that plain white cardstock. You'll see we're getting a nice softer generation, and you can see that pattern showing through. All right, now let's repeat the process. You don't really have to, but I do find it helps to intensify the technique. Now, you could try lighter colors here, and you can try darker colors. I just find that some dye ink colors intensify more with this technique than others. This blue raspberry on the first panel, you don't see the pattern a whole lot, but I found when playing around that if I used fresh asparagus, which is a green, it worked great. So just try the inks you have. With most, you can see the technique on both pieces. Now I did want this bird to not be just solid bright blue, so I'm coming in with blue denim, which is a darker kind of blue jean color. I put that on the tail of the bird and then used a blending brush to kind of soften the harsh edge. And I'm stamping that on top of our first image. Then I'll stamp the extra ink on top of our second one. So this is just going to give us a bit of darker color there towards the bottom of the bird. So here are 2 images. You have the first generation over there on the left, and you can see a little bit of that ornate fan showing through, but you can see more of it in this lighter second generation. Now on this first generation one, you don't see much, as I mentioned, of that ornate fan image showing through the bird, but I'm going to show you a way to make it stand out in a moment, so stay tuned for it. But first, let's create the little branch for him to sit on. I want to make sure that doesn't overlap with his little tail feathers there, so I'm putting a Post-it note over it just for quick masking. And I'll do the same on the second generation too. I will again stamp the branch first on our white cardstock piece that has the white background stamped. And I'm stamping with fresh asparagus ink. I find this works really well for the technique. I inked up the whole branch and stamped it on this piece. Then I'll bring in our plain white cardstock piece and stamp the extra ink. And I'll repeat that process one more time just to make everything intensify. Now this is a small image, so you won't see much of that background stamp showing through. But if I were to stamp a big image with this ink, you really would. If you look at the leaves on the image on the left, you can definitely see that ornate fan showing through. Now I want my branch to be brown, so I'm just inking that up with dark chocolate, stamping it onto our first panel with the white background stamped, and then stamping the second generation onto the second plain white panel. And I will repeat that one more time just to really intensify that dark black or dark brown look. I also have the little feet and the eyes. I will stamp this with black ink on the first panel and then stamp the second generation on the second panel. Now, you're not going to really see the pattern on these tiny images, but I did want to make sure it was intense on the first panel and that second generation on the second panel, just so the first one's bold and the second one is lighter. So here's our first one. You can kind of see that white background stamping. You don't see much of it showing through the bird because of the inks that I used. These colors just didn't show through much. However, we'll step it up in a moment. But on this second generation, you definitely see that pattern on the bird, and it just adds some fun interest. All right, so now this first panel, you have that white background stamping that's all around that bird. I heat set this so that white ink is completely dry. And I'm coming in with a very light ink and a very light hand, applying some of this ink with a blending brush very lightly. And what happens is this light ink gets grabbed by the white pigment ink, and you can see this ornate fan pattern showing up in the background. You'll see it when I hold it up to the camera. So now look at, you've got that soft sea glass colored ink around the bird. And that was the white pigment ink dried, and when you lightly put that light ink on top, it grabs it, and you get this beautiful result. Be sure that you heat set your white pigment ink before you use the blending brush to softly apply that ink so you don't smear it. Now, to turn these into cards, I use the Master Layouts 10 die set, another one that I like. There is a faux stitch rectangle and then a very slightly bigger solid rectangle so that you can create a layered piece like I did here. So this is the second generation one, the softer one, where you can see the ornate fans on the bird. I also stamped the ornate fans on a craft note card with white pigment ink, so that also adds some pattern to the background. And that sentiment there is from an older, I believe, discontinued Gina K Design stamp set, but she has many sets that have that style. Now, for the first generation, the more bold one, where we added the soft sea glass ink around it, I used the Master Layouts 2 die set that I showed you earlier, along with that Modern Roses stamp set for the Hello Friend. Here you can see the ornate fans very softly in the background. It gives such a great result. And you have that nice, bold first generation stamping. So with this technique, we were able to create 2 cards with a unique kind of textured look to it, a faux textured look. This technique would be great for those of you who prefer to make one-layer cards. So now that I've shown you how to do this faux textured or faux fabric stamping, I thought I'd show you how to do a faux textured stencil look. And this is beautiful and a great way to kind of soften a background that you've stenciled, and it works with any stencils. So here I have the Gina K Flowering Vine stencil set. This is from the kit that I showed you earlier. There are 4 stencils, 2 for the flowers and 2 for the leaves. Now I have Gina K white cardstock here. Any smooth white cardstock would work. In fact, probably any high quality white cardstock would work. I'm taping the first stencil into the corner of the cardstock. That way I know that each time I can line up the stencil with the corner and it'll line up the images. Now I haven't stamped anything on this white cardstock, it's just plain white cardstock. And I'm applying blue raspberry ink over some of the areas and then turquoise sea over other areas. Don't feel like you have to do everything the same or that you need to do each flower a different color. You could if you wanted. I'm just kind of varying the colors that I used on the background between these two, so like a bright blue and a turquoise. Now I'm coming in with the second stencil and I'm using a slightly darker color in those 2 color families. So I have Tranquil Teal and Blue Denim. You could instead do a heavier layer of the first 2 colors that you used, but I had these inks out, so I thought I'd put them to good use. And you can see how I'm creating flowers with just a little variation of blue and turquoise. Now I'll do the same thing over the leaves. I'll use grass green in some areas and then kind of a brighter Kelly green, the Lucky Clover, over other areas. Once I've applied that, I'll switch to the last stencil, and this just adds the darker details, so I'll use Fresh Asparagus and Christmas Pine. I'm doing this pretty quick. You'll see that it gives beautiful results with very little time or effort. So now I have this great, beautiful stenciled background. You could do this next step with any stenciled background that you may have. I'm putting it back into my stamping tool and I'm stamping on top of it with the Gina K Gauze stamp. I highly recommend this stamp. It is definitely a must-have because it can be used for many great techniques such as kissing and more. Well, here I'm going to stamp on top of our colorful stenciling with this gauze stamp and white pigment ink. Now, I could have done the first technique this way, where I stamp all the birds and then stamp on top with white pigment ink to show that texture. It would definitely show up more. However, I like that 2-for-1 second generation image we got with the first technique. So I wanted to show this variation also. So I thought I was going to be done with that, but I decided to ink it up again and stamp it again just to make that white a little more intense. And this is going to give a fine kind of, it looks like a piece of tulle is laying across our stamping. And it kind of softens the background and makes it a little more subtle and fabric looking. And so now I can add whatever I want on top of it. Again, this would be another good one for a one-layer card design. Now you could absolutely stop here if you wanted, but I thought I'd add some shine to it. If you wanted to stop here, definitely heat set it. But if you want to do this next step, skip the heat setting for now and add some perfect pearls, that pigment powder that adds a pearly shine like I used on the note cards earlier. I'm just brushing this over the entire background and it'll stick to the white pigment ink. I'll brush off the excess and wipe it with a dry cloth. And now that kind of linen looking texture that we stamped on top, or the gauze texture we stamped on top, will have some shine to it. And it just steps up that stenciled background and makes it look really unique. So you can see here, when I tilt it in the light, you can see some of that pearly shine, and you see that kind of tulle looking or linen finish that it has. All right, so I used the Master Layouts 2 die set to die cut from that panel, and then a teal cardstock mat that's slightly bigger to go behind it. Then I have a white note card where I stamped the Ornate fans with sea glass ink. So now I have this beautiful stenciled background that looks like it's fabric. It looks like a linen or like there's tulle over it, and it has that shine. So you can do this with any background stencils that you may have, and it just really adds some fun interest. Now I use that gauze stamp, but you definitely could use like a pinstripe or a polka dot. Something with small detail would work best. All right, now let's do that again because I really liked the result of it. I wanted to use these Gina K Designs poppy stencils, these perfect poppies. I love poppies. I've tried to grow them and have had no luck, so I like to make them on my cards a lot. I decided to go for a traditional red color here. So I did Red Hot over the first stencil. Then the second stencil that adds details, I used Cherry Red, which is the perfect red color, like a perfect Christmas red. So on the last card, I did a stenciled background and then stamped on top. This time I'm doing a stenciled kind of focal point and stamping on top, just to demonstrate that you can use a variety of stencils. The stencils you use, however, it's good to have some solid areas so that when you stamp on top, you can see that white ink. Now I did black for the centers of my poppies. I'm doing this as fast as I can. I wanted this to be just one of those quick card designs. And then I did fresh asparagus over the stems, which is just an excellent green. Now I'll put this into my stamping tool. I'm using that same gauze stamp and stamping this with white pigment ink on top. Now Gina K does have some other clear background stamps that would work well for this. She has a music note one. She has like an elegant script one. Anything that has fine, tiny detail pattern would work. But this gauze, it's perfect for that faux fabric or faux linen look. So this time I stamped it twice just to make sure that it was bright white. Also, I think my ink pad needs a little re-inking, so I'll have to do that later. I used the Master Layouts 2 die set to cut that faux stitch panel and the red panel behind it that's slightly bigger, and I put that onto a white note card that is 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. I stamped "Thanks so much" onto those stems, and I plan to make more of these in a card set to give as a gift, where each one has different color poppies. When I do so, I'll stamp that "Thanks so much" a little bit higher. I felt like I stamped it a little low. But that is one advantage of making multiple cards. If you do something on the first card that you're not thrilled with, you can fix it on the additional cards. Now I have a couple pieces I wanted to show you that use the technique I used at the beginning of this video, where we did this stamping over the white background stamping. Now I didn't get to finish these off, I ran out of time, but I really liked this Serene Skies stamp. All of those solid images are great for the technique. So here are the two pieces I've created. I haven't turned them into cards yet, but I thought I'd show you anyways. I stamped with the Ornate fans with white pigment ink first. Then I stamped images from this stamp set on top with dye ink. Now here is the first generation one. I also used a light amount of sea glass ink over the background to make that white stamped image pop a little bit. You can really see the Ornate stamping showing through that fresh asparagus grass on the bottom. And our second generation here has a lighter look to it. Now these are small solid images. If you want your pattern to stand out more, use bigger solid images, or start with a finer detailed background stamp. But I really love that soft second generation image. I do plan to turn these into 5x7 cards. At the beginning, I promised to let you know about a way to get a free stamp set. This is the free set, and it is offered over at Gina K Designs if you spend $75 or more. And I think you get free US shipping around the same price point too. I'll have that information in the description below. This incentive set changes once in a while, so you always want to check her website to see what is available. All right, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope it inspires you to try to get this faux textured or faux fabric stamping and stenciled look. It's just a great way to use our supplies creatively. If you're interested in the supplies I talked about, it's all in the YouTube description below. At the end here, I'll link to those related videos so you can find some more ideas. I thank you for spending this time with me, and I'll see you again soon.